Okay. Thanks, Dave. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay, good. All right, I'll share my screen here. You guys can see that?
Yep, we can.
All right, good. Well, welcome to the next installment of our machine learning workshops. I wanted to kind of recap where this started and then kind of explain how this attaches onto that. And the piece that I was hoping to capture today was unsupervised learning and kind of how that's different from what we've done in the past 3 sessions. So without any further ado, our goals are pretty simple, and it's essentially to give you the background on unsupervised learning and an understanding, walk away with an understanding of what it is and kind of some introductory concepts regarding it. So back in our first session, they presented a couple slides on machine learning, what it is, and why it is important. And the crux of it is that a lot of this is mathematical models used to understand data. Is there anything you want to add to this one, Dave? Since you put this one together, you're better expert than I.
No, I just I do want to take a minute, as I often do in this situation, to remind us that the field of machine learning falls under the domain of AI. And a lot of people kind of equate the two, and they are not equal. One would argue that all machine learning is AI, but not all AI is machine learning. And machine learning is a subset of AI that specifically focuses around, excuse me, mathematical models, generally constructed around some notion of features from the data, or features or meta features around the data, around their distributions, their spatial or temporal properties, and then putting those into a model such that you can either make a prediction or maybe you can do a classification. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. We spend a lot of time, which Chris will then go into, a lot of time talking about, supervised approaches, and those are really important because it lets us kind of control the process. But when you control the process, you constrain the process as well. And an unsupervised machine learning approach lets us really open up and just kind of explore the world more open-ended, which is often gives us good sense of, or helps us generate hypotheses for how we might go forward in more rigorous analyses. So that's really my only comment here.
I think that was a very important clarification too, because it kind of leads into this slide, which is to highlight essentially the differences between supervised and unsupervised learning and the different reasons you may use it. Typically, you use machine learning, as the top 2 bullets show, is for an approximation, the ability to take your data and create an approximation for how things fit to your data and an underlying model possibly, or classification, where you want to group things that are alike together and identify them as part of some category. So in the past, we covered supervised learning, which starts with the data, but then says, I believe that there is an underlying model to this data, an underlying structure that we can use to try to interpret what the data is telling us. And that goes back to even the first session where we discussed linear regression, or as we moved into logistic regression. Those are both supervised techniques. This one's going to take a different approach, which is unsupervised learning. As Dave was pointing out with it, this allows us to start with the data and say, well, what does the data tell us? Let's not impose a predefined structure to it. Let's just see what the data has to say for itself. And that's the intro to unsupervised learning that we want to get to today. found a couple of good definitions for it. Essentially, this reiterates what I said before, which is you have data and you want to let the data speak for itself. Whereas supervised learning, we focused on having data that had some sense of an input and an output, be it for regression or for classification. In this sense, those labels don't really apply to unsupervised learning because you're allowing the data to just be the data and then work from there.
So if I could make a comment here, one of the important things when we talk about this is again conceptual. It's related to this relationship between AI and machine learning. Although unsupervised classification or unsupervised learning is a form of machine learning, it trends or looks towards more of the broader AI, which is how do we make an agent and whether it be an algorithm or hardware act independently. And if you think about how humans work, a large component of a human's life falls into the category of learning life, falls in the category of unsupervised learning. We explore the world, we make associations between what we see and what we touch without necessarily having rules behind it. And so that's one important reason to understand this domain of unsupervised learning. If I tell each of you guys to go to a large parking lot and classify all your data in that parking lot, tell me about all the cars and give me the different clusters or groups of those. Some people are going to come back and talk about the number of wheels, 2 versus 4, or maybe 6 if it's a dually or something. Someone's going to come back and talk about colors. We got reds and blues and greens. And someone's going to come back and say, well, it's about its utility. So I've got small sedans and I've got large trucks. And without giving you any constraints, when you go do that, you can group things in any number of different ways, and all of those can be meaningful. They can reflect both the environment as well as your own perspective. If ahead of time I teach you about trucks versus sedans, then you may miss some of those other important features, whether that be, a 2-door or 4-door, for example, and that might have a meaningful thing. And so again, reflecting on how we live as humans, this whole notion of unsupervised learning is really important. A second, more practical aspect of this is that most of the world isn't labeled for us. When you walk out in the world, when you're a young child, no one put a big sign on all the trees that said, this is a tree and this is not a tree. We've had to figure that out. And my biggest example from way back in college, when I was doing a lot more cognitive science, is classifying a chair. So a chair, as soon as you give me a definition of a chair, I'm going to give you something that looks nothing like that definition. And then you're going to have to rethink your definition of chair, because chairs are not all chair or chair-like things are already predefined. And this actually gets to creativity and exploration and a number of cognitive concepts. So understanding unsupervised learning, recognizing right now we're taking from a very mathematical perspective to the more conceptual, is a great way to kind of stretch into that space. So I apologize for all the talking. Go ahead.
No, I think that was great highlighting of why this is important and why we wanted to move into this topic, cover this today. From that first session, again, they presented this machine learning matrix, and I thought it would be helpful for people to kind of see where some of the pieces that we've covered so far fit. The linear and logistic regression are obviously upper left quadrant, but now we're moving down into unsupervised categories, and specifically today we're going to talk about classification. I'm going to start out with an example of k-means classification, or clustering as it's called, which is in the bottom right quadrant there. But this is not a complete list. There are so many different areas that we can get into that can fit in supervised, unsupervised, etc., that you should take this more as a starting point, as kind of a learning basis to look at things and then grow your understanding from there. So I'm going to start talking about k-means clustering. You're probably like, well, what's k-means clustering mean? Well, yeah, exactly. Clustering is essentially our attempt to take data and find out if there's natural groupings within the data where it makes sense to say all the data in this group is similar enough that we're going to call that a cluster, and then see how many clusters the data might have in it, and say, okay, then we have a certain number of clusters within our data. K-means clustering starts by just placing some guessing centers for the different clusters and then grouping data accordingly, and then fitting the data iteratively to those clusters and moving them around until it kind of converges to the most likely set of groups for a given number of clusters. So you pick a number of clusters and see how well the data can be grouped into that number of clusters. But it's not the only type of clustering there is. This is kind of this is an approach called partitional clustering that's more useful when you see a picture like in the bottom right corner there, where you have data that's kind of flattened, but it's clear that there's some sort of associations going on in the data structure. But you can also have other types of clustering, like hierarchical clustering. That's where you could have clusters within a cluster. And you could even have density-based clustering. Our example would be more like density-based clustering. But there's a number of regions even within clustering that you can get into. And I just picked one for today because this is the example when I was learning that I found kind of the easiest to pick up right away. So I have a couple references in the slides if anyone wants to see them. But with that, I was going to switch over to the first tutorial, which is on Google Colab. So open up a browser, go to colab.research.google.com, and that's where we can do this work. And this tool works really well for exploring these notebooks and sharing them and working with data, because it's got pretty much all the tools already available to you with just a Google account. So if you go File, Open Notebook, across the top, you'll see some selections. If you click on GitHub, and then in the search bar, type SMNIEEE and enter, our ML workshop should be available. If it doesn't say ML workshop, it should be there in your click pull down. Then has all the workbooks that we shared so far. You scroll down to session 4 and click Intro to Unsupervised Learning. Is that working for everyone? Anyone need a chance to get that going? I'll wait a minute.
So I just put the Colab link out there in the thing.
The chat. Okay, thanks.
Brian did a better job than me. He's that techie guy. He knows his stuff.
So was everyone able to navigate there?
Yes. Yep, the link Ryan sent out worked for me.
Okay, good. All right, in the top here, it says copy to drive. You can copy this to your local drive so that you can edit it and execute. I don't know that you have to save it to your local drive to edit it, but you do if you want to save it. It may let you do it in Scratch, I'm not sure. But I would recommend you save it to your own personal drive and then execute it from there. All right, so in this little tutorial, we're just going to work through a basic k-means clustering. Oh, I spelled it wrong. Example. We're going to download some data, take a look at it, try some stuff, play with it, really just do a brute force understanding, and then cover how scikit-learn makes it a little easier for us and allows us to investigate the number of clusters a little better so we can pick what you might consider an optimal number. Although with the data we have, optimal is really relative because this is a synthetic data set made for the specific purpose of testing and running clustering algorithms. So as I said before, clustering is just a set of methods for grouping data. I'm not going to go into too much more detail. If anyone has any questions, put them in the chat. But we're going to start by downloading some data and unzipping it. So if you run this cell under download and unzip the data, you'll go out to this website, you know, grab a zip file with a bunch of cluster synthetic data sets in it, and it'll unzip them all so that they're available to us. If you click over here on the left, you'll see them all listed there. Pretty handy. So now we have our data. So what do we want to do first? Well, we got to read in the data and take a look at it. So in this cell is just opening the data file that we're going to pick, G2-2-40. We're just going to read it in and format it so that we can work with it. And then to check the data, we're going to plot it. So in this cell, you'll see here all the data. So it's a two-dimensional data. It's got an X value and a Y value for each data point. And you can see that it's pretty clumped into what looks like maybe one big group of data. And that's what we're going to investigate. To run the k-means algorithm, it's actually not that complicated of an algorithm, but there's more efficient ways to do it than what we're going to brute force here. But I felt like brute forcing through it would kind of help develop an understanding of the steps involved. So we're going to start by picking a number of centroids. So say we want to try to find two groups, you'd pick k = 2 centroids. And by centroid, I mean a center of each group is essentially what you're trying to find. And then for each center, you're going to start out by randomly placing them somewhere in your data set. And I picked a really simple version where it just picks a random point within the X and Y limits and places the center there. And then it's going to iterate on a loop. And what this loop will do is it'll take each center and it'll look at the distance from every data point to that center. And then for each data point, it'll decide which center it's closest to, and it'll group the data based on its closest centroid. Then once all the data is sorted by its closest centroid, it's going to take an average of all the data for a given centroid and then move the centroid to that mean location. And it's going to keep doing that until essentially you've converged on some convergence criteria. In this case, we're just going to run the same loop 10 times and watch the centers move. And then at the end, you just assess your results. Now, this is skipping a lot of really critical pieces, but the high-level algorithm applies for most applications of this. So in this cell, we're going to just I picked a starting value of k = 2 for 2 centers. If you want to play with this data, you can try 3, 4, 5, whatever. And then next we say x-min, x-max, y-min, y-max. We're just finding the bounds of the data so that we can place our centers within those bounds. And that's what this centroids line is doing. It's just saying, I'm going to pick some random points using these functions available from NumPy. And we're going to place k number of points within those bounds and use that as our starting points. So if we do this, we'll plot the data and we'll plot these centroids and kind of see where they start out. So run this cell. So here you can see all the data is plotted again. You can see it picked 2 random centers, one at about 600 and 625. The other one's about 630 and 400 some. Yeah. So using these two centers, and we'll start
can I
running
ask
our algorithm. Yeah, go ahead.
So I don't know if this would change the results, but does this assume that that the points have a certain distribution? Like, does it look for the center of two Gaussians or two Poisson distributions?
Well, the way I did it assumes nothing about the data other than you have some bounds. And you could even, as we get into the later section, we'll talk about how scaling the data helps make some of those decisions. But you can try to use smart algorithms that assume different things if you know stuff about your data, such as the distribution is Gaussian or Poisson. You can try to use that to help place your centers. But this one was just a brute force, dumb. Anywhere within the X and Y limits is fair game, all equally likely, not placing it closer to the data or further away. And in some applications, you could even just pick a random data point as your first center, which is also a useful way to start out the algorithm. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yes.
Advanced, yeah, advanced stuff would, if you're really getting into this, you'd spend more time looking at how to do that wisely. I didn't spend the time on this this initial look. So in this next cell here, what we're going to do is we're going to create a list and keep track of how the centers are moving as the loop iterates. And then, as I said, we're going to iterate 10 times. And for each iteration, we're going to, or over the iterations, we're going to count how many data points are in labeled for each center. And then we're going to sum up all the centers so that we can take a mean for the centroid at the end, and that'll be our new centroids. So this loop starts by creating some arrays for storing that data, and then it iterates through the data points, which is also a brute force. There's a lot. NumPy allows array operations like this to be a lot smoother than what I did, but I wanted it to be obvious what we were doing. So for each data point, we come in, we look at the difference between the data point and each center. That's what this line is doing. And then for each difference, it squares it, and then it sums up the squares so that we get kind of an average distance, kind of a Euclidean distance between every data, or for each data point and all the possible centers. Then it finds the smallest distance and says, that's the center that I want to associate with. And then it increments the counter and the sum so that we can do the average at the end. Then once all the data has been labeled, then it goes through and calculates the new average and appends the new centers to this list of centroids. And it'll iterate this loop 10 times and we can watch how that behaves. So you run that cell. And then down here, we'll plot the results. As you can see in the data, what started out, remember up here, we had a data point, center picked up here, down here. Well, the lower centroid moved into the bottom left corner of the clusters of the data. And then the upper centroid moved closer into the kind of upper right corner of this cluster of data. So you can see how those centers moved around as the iterations ran, which is good, but what do the values actually look like? So in this cell, what we'll plot is the X and Y values of those centers from their list. And you can see that they all converge actually pretty quickly within 4 or so iterations to a steady state value for the X and Y centers of these two selected clusters. Because we're trying a k equals 2. If you did k equals 3 or k equals 4, maybe you'd need more values as the points move around. But for this one, you can see it steady states pretty quickly. Okay, so after you think you've got your a good selection of centers. Now we gotta go look at the data. So we'll take the data and we'll plot it based on the centers it's associated with. And you can see how it drew the two groups here. And if I gave you that data and just said, assign all the data to one of 2 points, I think a lot of people would just kind of draw a line through it like this and come up with a similar sorting of the data. So it kind of intuitively makes sense for two centers. And it's really not that hard to implement, you know, even in a brute force way like this, but it's clearly not the best solution. One thing we can do though is we can also plot a 2D histogram here and kind of look how the data is distributed from a probabilistic point of view. So when you look at this, it becomes more apparent that there's probably 2 densest locations. You know, maybe that's kind of indicating that 2 is the right number of clusters to assign for this, but it's just another way of looking at the data and saying, okay, well, it's really dense in a couple areas. Maybe I could manually pick some points and speed up the process, who knows? So does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah, that's good.
So before we move on, I'd like to add a little color commentary. Is that okay?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Great. So I think that there's a couple of things here that we want to talk through from a conceptual point of view, because it plays out. This example is really good. It flushes things out, but there's some nuances here that are worth noting. Number one is this definition of a cluster. Now, right now, the definition of a cluster is 2 random points in the X and Y domain, which is fine. There's other ways, and then as you, as you kind of evolve the clusters, we go back to this notion of a centroid, which is one way to calculate the middle of a cluster. There are other ways to calculate the middle of a cluster, or maybe you don't care about the cluster. Maybe you want to add some force that says, I want my clusters to be away from each other. So there's other measurements that could be used. One of the challenges, let me see if I can pose this as a question. Is a centroid guaranteed to be a point in the sample of points that represent a cluster?
No.
It is not. What does a centroid represent?
Or where the center of the points that represent a cluster would be. The counter example I was thinking of is like points arranged as a donut. The centroid would be where the hole is, but not actually inside any of the points.
Awesome. Really, really good example. And so if we're using real world examples, all right, and we want to classify or cluster people by height, or even worse, discrete variables like eye color, all right, a centroid it has the advantage of it works really well from a numeric distribution point of view, and it makes sense when you see it on screen, but it doesn't work really well when you have discrete objects and or discrete classes, or your variables are discrete. So if I need to represent the central representation of a cluster, but it has to be one example, there has to be an exemplar in that group, a centroid is not the right way to do it. It doesn't mean it's bad. I want people to be aware of that nuance. That is one of the 3 major factors here. The first one being that you need to have a notion of what it means to be a cluster. And right now we're defining clusters by a centroid, which is not necessarily a real world instance of whatever you're measuring. Could be,
right,
but not necessarily.
Right. It depends on what you want to learn about the data. So it's what meaningful information do you want to derive, and how useful is the metrics you're using towards deriving that information. Another piece that I've left out of this is it assumes all data points are equally valid. And you could have a scenario where certain data points are weighted higher than others, which would shift the centroids around, because a center of mass for an important data point will pull on it more than one that is weakly involved. So there is a lot of more nuance to take into account depending on the data you're looking at and the specifics of what you would like to learn from it.
Where would the weighting come from? I'm trying to think that through.
Well, it could be the importance of a specific point, or say in David's case, he was mentioning more discretely sampled data. Say you have 10 instances of a specific, of someone having 10 of something and only one person having 9 of something. Well, you would have to weight 10 6 times more than 9 because you can't distinguish between a 10 and so.
Okay.
So there could be other scenarios too. That's the one that comes to mind for me. But weighting of data points can also affect how this runs and how you do the analysis.
So I can give you a biomedical example that's used in radiology. So we have radiologists that will look at medical images, not surprising, and they'll do some sort of diagnostic task, like detecting a liver tumor, okay? Well, it turns out, well, we all like to think that's a really binary thing. It's really not. You do a detection and then you add a certain level of confidence to that. Now, if I want to develop a clustering algorithm that clusters tumors versus non-tumors based on what it sees in an image, I can use that weight of the confidence that's provided by a radiologist to help influence the interpretation of whether or not it's malignant or benign, for example. So we can bring in that weighting factor in any number of ways. The other way that this comes in is if you need to, so you might have different scales for your axes such that one should really be log compressed. And one way you do that is you can scale your data or weight your data with like a log compression to squeeze everything down. So there's any number of ways to use that factor. So that I think that's really good. That is closely related to my second point, which is, so we talked about defining cluster with regards to its centrality. The second point is related to how do you calculate the distance between clusters or the distance between points even. So we talked about Euclidean distance. That one makes a lot of sense. Since I'm going to get into it, I won't spend too much time on this, but can anyone identify a different way to measure distance between 2 points? So who can tell me what a Manhattan distance is?
Yeah. So the Manhattan distance is just the sum of the orthogonal axes distances rather than having the square root sum of squares.
Absolutely. And so the reason it's called the Manhattan distance, it's also called the city block distance, because the notion is the distance to get from point A to point B requires that you walk only in one direction at a time along the x-axis and the y versus being able to cut across the diagonal. So there's some cases where that's a useful measure, and there's others. My third one, and then I just got these last two. So the third one is the next important parameter, which is K. So let's ask the question. This makes a lot of sense from these distributions. We chose 2 and it looked really good. Does that mean if I chose 4, I wouldn't get an answer?
That's a good segue into the next section of this.
Absolutely. So then I'll cue that one. I'll leave that one for a minute because then I have one last color commentary here, and that's closely related as well. Does anyone want to comment on the notion of convergence? What does it mean to converge? And does this algorithm guarantee convergence?
Well, convergence depends on your metric for reaching some sort of steady state, right? So in the upcoming sections, we'll cover two techniques for calculating that. One is the sum of squared errors, which is what I used above. But as far as guaranteeing it, I guess I'm not sure if that's guaranteed for this technique.
So I thank you, Chris. You're absolutely right. So I'm glad you're going to cover it. Convergence is not guaranteed in this case. And in fact, I could probably draw a picture with a bunch of dots that would show that this particular method would not be able to converge because essentially points would jump back and forth between different clusters and never really settle down into one or the other one. And this is where that whole outlier issue comes up as one to be concerned about. So I'm not asking anyone to fully understand or adopt, an analysis around convergence. It's just something to think about when you're doing these things, that there is a component, because it's iterative. Anytime we talk about an iterative algorithm, you talk about how do you choose when your algorithm ends, and that is how it converges. And so in this case, it converges really nicely, but in some cases it won't necessarily converge, and that's good to keep in mind. So I thank you for letting me make some comments. I'll let you go ahead and continue.
All right. So now we're going to use the scikit-learn toolkit for basically doing the same thing we did before, but also investigating the data a little further. One of the pieces about using packages such as scikit-learn is their functions want to take in the data in a certain format or with certain assumptions. And often they'll provide a way of pre-processing your data so that it fits what they want as inputs to their pre-implemented algorithm. So for example, what we're going to use is the k-means function from scikit-learn, but that wants your data to have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1 in each of its dimensions. And we could do that. We could do it by hand and calculate those values and adjust all the data to fit in that criteria, but they give us a nice little function called standard scalar that'll do it for us. So on this slide here, what we're going to do is use that function. We'll pass it our data, and then we'll plot it again and just see that it's the same data, but now it's got a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1 along both the X and Y axes. So when you run that cell, you'll notice, yep, data looks the same, but you can see that for each axis, for each dimension, the mean is 0, and it's not completely obvious here, but the standard deviation is about 1. So this data is now prepared and ready to pass in to the k-means class that scikit-learn provides for us. So to use that, we have to import the k-means package, and then we have to pass it some parameters. So initializing it, this is where you pick your centers like we did before. We're just going to leave it with random number of initializations, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I believe it tries the initialization a certain number of times and looks for, I'm trying to remember what criteria it uses. Then it runs it a max iteration of the loops maximum number of times of 10. That's where we did our for loop above of 10 times. And then we also tell it how many clusters you want to look for, which is k. Before we specified k as 2, and it's still 2 and as far as this cell is concerned. So when you run this, it's just generating a estimator that we can then pass our data to, and it will make essentially the same assumptions we made above and process the data. So now that we have our estimator ready, you can fit it around this cell. So you can see it's done. It happened pretty fast. Now we can see how many iterations it took to converge. Now it has its own definition of converge, and this one, by default, it's assuming a sum of squared errors convergence. So you can see here that when you run this cell, it only took 3. So it made some guesses for the initial centroids, but it only took it 3 passes to converge. Ours looked like it stabilized around 4. So that kind of makes sense. Now we'll look at what centroids it found. And it got basically the same values that we found above. We can take a look at the error. They call it inertia, but it doesn't really tell us much on its own. It's more useful as a metric for analyzing, for example, what we'll get to, which is the number of clusters that we select. And then now we'll plot the data with its appropriate labels. And you can see that they got the same answer we did, but theirs took a lot fewer lines of code because scikit-learn's done all the hard work for us and added a bunch of features and advanced inputs that we didn't. So using this package, there we got the same output basically. So now you ask yourself, well, what's the best number of clusters? We picked two seems to make sense, but is it the best one? And that's where really investigating the data becomes more important. So in this scenario, what we're going to do is we're going to run the same test we did above, but we're going to collect the errors from the sum squared error output and look at how the error changes with the number of clusters. So we're going to run from 1 cluster up to 10, well, 1 through 9, and then look at how the error behaves as we increase the number of clusters that we look for. So I had to print out here some metrics. You can see that the squared error is going down. It looks like it's starting to get kind of asymptotic. So we'll plot it and take a look at it. You'll see that, yep, the error starts really high at 1, comes down substantially at 2, and then starts kind of exponentially decaying. And it goes all the way out to 9 here, and it's still kind of decaying. So where would you pick? Well, you could pick what's called a knee point. Look for a point of basically where the data goes from really steep to really flat and say, well, the knee is my metric, or you get to have some other metric. Luckily, scikit-learn has another option available. Well, they have a number of options, but this one is particularly useful for our little investigation. It's called silhouette coefficients. And this one, instead of looking at the sum squared error like we did in our brute force approach or even in the previous couple cells, this one is a method of calculating how well does a specific data point align to its closest center and how far is it from the other possible centers. So if a data point's really close to one center and it's really far from all the other centers, then it's a better match than if it was, say, kind of in between two centers and slightly closer to one than the other. So it's a more advanced algorithm for looking at that metric and assessing, how good is our particular number of clusters in this example. So we'll run this one, redoing what we did before, but now we're going to use this silhouette coefficient method instead. And you can see the scores there as well. And it's already starting to stabilize by about 8 or 9 maybe. We'll plot that score. You see the score comes down to about 4 and kind of has a little decay. So maybe 4 or 7 might be good there. So let's just look at it with 4. What does the data partitioning look like, or the data grouping look like if we pick 4 clusters, since 4 seems to be a pretty good point there. We rerun this analysis with 4 clusters. You can see how the labeled data then comes out. You have this yellow data way on the upper right, then a section of green data. Then you have this maroon and light blue data over here on the bottom left. And this shows you how, even though it looks like the data is maybe best as 2 clusters when you look above, but now, well, actually it might be better with 4, maybe 7. And this is where looking and digging into the data and letting the data tell you what is best or what it's really trying to say is more important than trying to tell the data what it should be saying. And that's the essence of the introduction to unsupervised learning in this notebook. And now I'd like to pass it over to David, and we'll cover the next notebook.
Okay, so I'm gonna, as I'll take over the screen here, everyone should be able to go to File, Open, and they should be able to open their other notebook, which I believe is called, let me get this share. Let's make sure we get this up. Okay, so the other one's called biomed clustering, and essentially it's a direct extension of what Chris did. I think Chris did a really good job. Oh, there's a chat message. I'm getting better at this. Brian comes in again with the right answer. Good job with the link. Essentially, it is a direct extension of what Chris did. I think Chris did a really nice job providing everyone with a code base that if they wanted to build their own k-means, it has everything you need, all the different pieces pulled out, and you can do that. And then he introduced the scikit-learn. This is also scikit-learn, but I've contextualized it around a biomedical application. And actually, I haven't done any work, quite honestly. This is more or less directly taken from this notebook here. I need to, how do I see here? Can you still see my screen, or is it just black right now? I don't know.
I can see it.
Oh, you can?
Yeah.
Okay, all right, good. All right, I like it on this monitor better. So essentially what we have is a tutorial that's out there on the internet. And so you can find it, it's around clustering, but it happens to be a biomedical application. And I'm just gonna go through that kind of step by step with a couple, again, commentaries along the way. So this image is from a microarray experiment. So microarray technology is kind of the original technology used for doing gene sequencing and looking at SNPs, or little components of a genetic sequence, to identify if a gene is active or not active, or if it's present or not, excuse me, not present. So what this is it's actually a tiny piece of material with all these little micro wells in it. And inside, and each dot, each little circular dot you see in there is a well. And inside that well, it's basically doped with a little sphere, and that sphere has like proteins on it. And what that does is that when you wash your tissue, let's take a sample from my nose, right? Jam something on my nose, take a bunch of my boogers and you smear it all over there. Slightly more technical than that. It's a general idea. Essentially what's going to happen is that this array is going to look at the activity of the genes that were coming from my boogers. Again, slightly more technical than that. And each one of these dots represents a different gene or gene segment or SNP that we're analyzing. And so you can see there's a lot of them here. How many? There's about 12 to 13,000 dots in this thing. So what we do is we go out and we find people and we jam sticks up their nose, and then we do this test and we see the activity in each person, more or less. And so the intensity level reflects the amount of activity. And it also gives you slightly different kinds of activity. So you can have suppressive activity, you can have enhancement activity, like there's a number of properties there. And so we can take this and I can look at this and I can pretend like I'm seeing something, but I actually don't see anything. Now, if I take this one and I take the next person and I show theirs and I look at them and say, are these two people similar or are they different? I couldn't tell you. In fact, most humans would have a hard time interpreting the similarity or the difference between these things. Now I could force a model on it. I could say, here's an image from a person who grew up in southern Minnesota eating hot dish, and here's a person who grew up in Nebraska eating a bunch of corn. And how does their gene profile, their gene expression profile look different? And that forces some sort of constraint on it. But here, I just want to take all the data and say, do these things group into different interesting groups? And then once I know if they group, then I can say, what are the features that make that important? And we're not going to get to that second question. We're just going to talk about the first question, is how do we group them? So again, the intensity value for each dot represents a measurement of gene expression activity, whether or not the gene is active or not. And this paper from Nature kind of describes how microarrays work. But essentially, in this particular tutorial, the notion is that no one gene is interesting. The body is a complex thing. Lots of genes are firing and not firing, and they're coordinating and they're anti-coordinating. So there's two interesting questions that you might ask this data. Which genes are co-regulated? That means which genes turn on and off in the same way within a sample. So I can look at within a sample what's going on, and then which individuals are similar to other individuals and have similar gene expression between samples. That means if I see a whole bunch of genes lighting up or activating, and they're the same genes across multiple people, maybe it says something about their common genetic pool. So this happens to be one image of 128. They're actually not stored as images. I'm only showing them as images. They're stored as data files. And we'll be looking at approximately 12,000 genes for 128 people. And the goal is to look for common patterns among these 128 people. So the first thing is to download the data set to your computer. Now, I didn't have this cool way that Chris did it, so I apologize for that. What everyone needs to do is their first step is click on this link, and it's going to save the file locally to your directory. So I'm going to do that here. I'm going to click on it, and it's going to pop up a box, and I'm going to put it in my C/temp directory, and I'm going to save it as data. Now, you guys might save in your downloads directory, or I don't know. Just keep your eye out for that. Are we still on? Is everyone still in?
Yep.
No problem. So,
Yep.
okay. Down here at the corner, you can see that it found it. I'm using Chrome. I can say show in folder. And I don't know if it shows that or not, but basically it says that it's in my temp folder. Okay.
I think your screen might be frozen.
Oh no. Really? Oh my goodness.
I'm just seeing, I haven't seen anything change. Oh no, now it moved.
Okay. All right. Sorry about that. Okay. So I don't know why it froze. I'm back. Click on the link, shows up in the corner, show in folder so you can find it. So now you know where it is. So this isn't as cool as Chris. I really want to write down how Chris did his. So we're going to go through our things. The first thing is the libraries. We haven't talked much about these different kind of libraries, and I don't want to spend a lot of time. I'll just briefly introduce them. That pandas is a way to store data. IO is a way to convert data. Colab lets us load files, and then zip file actually lets us in Python extract files directly from zip files. So I'm going to hit play on there. I recommend you guys do the same thing. And then in this next one, essentially it's going to say upload the file for me. So when we hit play, it's going to say choose your file. So you click on that and you go to your temp directory or wherever it is. And I have data.zip. So I clicked on that and you can see it's loading up the data. That will take just a minute. So while it's doing that, anyone having trouble right now? So while mine's going, I will use this as an opportunity. We're spending a lot of time appropriately on the different methodologies. There's a whole nother space to doing machine learning and doing data science, and that is just efficiency of developing a pipeline, understanding how to get your data loaded, understanding how to queue up your data and all that stuff. And you see some of these along the way. So I happen to have a method that lets me load up files by downloading from the internet and then uploading them into the cloud. In contrast, Chris had a method that was able to download it directly from the internet onto the machine, onto the virtual machine that is your Colab, and then load it up directly from there. There's other tools as well. For example, this next method, which we're not going to run, actually lets me mount my Google Drive. So I can store a bunch of data in my Google Drive, and pandas, this thing called PD reads CSV, can read directly from that Google Drive right into this application. So someday, when maybe we'll take a lecture to talk about just optimizing these things like IO, which is a lot of work. We spend a lot of time in IO and data curation. And so this is just a couple of different ways. Now,
one quick note, the upload function does not appear to work in Firefox, if there's anyone out there like me that uses that.
I'm sorry, I had no idea. If you want, Jonathan, you can try the way that Chris did. If you have that other window open.
No, I already just switched over to Chrome.
Okay, all right, fair enough. It kind of makes sense. Google Chrome is just so tightly integrated. I'm not surprised, but that doesn't mean it's good. It just, I was convenient in how I did it. Is everyone else doing okay that I can continue?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yes.
All right. So here again, one of those tricks about trying to be efficient, you can use this line here, this is zip file bytes.io. Essentially what that does is it takes this, it loaded up that zip file into memory. Not that anyone cares about this, but I think it's awesome. It loaded it up as a chunk of memory, and bytes.io said, oh, that stream of memory, I'm going to pretend that's a file. And so bytes.io will take a chunk of memory and create it as an in-memory file system, and then the zip file can automatically read that. And so I'm just going to click on that, and what that's going to do is it's going to go into that zip file and automatically pull out the file called gene expression. All right, so gene expression is the file that we're going to be using. It's at 12,000 rows, 12,625 columns by 128 rows, which is each of the subjects. And what this does is it puts it in essentially an in-memory spreadsheet. In fact, I'm just gonna, for the sake of doing something here real quick while people are loading, I'm gonna do this thing. I'm gonna take a look at my X train, which is the name of my variable, and I can take a look at the head of that variable. Okay, that's gonna show me the first head, I think it's like 10 or 20 rows of my spreadsheet. So it's in Google or in Python language, a spreadsheet is called a data frame. A data frame has the flexibility of not just being numbers, but you can have numbers and letters and other things. I don't think we've talked a lot about data frames, but that's what a data frame is. And this stores things in a data frame. And so you can see we've got all these different variables and all these different subjects in this data set. And just to maintain continuity, I'm also going to use scikit-learn to understand how to do k-means, but then we're going to move on to the other ones. So here in this next one, again, we're going to import k-means. We're going to have some scaling availability. And what we're going to do in this case, because we already know about k-means and we already learned about how to choose a cluster size, what we'd like to do is do more or less that analysis for choosing the right number of clusters. So in this case, I have it set up that the range that it's going to analyze is from 2 until whatever your max range is. So everyone needs to change me to something larger than 3. 3 is not very interesting. If your range goes from 2 to less than 3, you're not going to get very many points. So I'm going to put in 10 there. So I'm actually going to sample 2 all the way up to 3, and I'm going to rerun the model over and over again. Now that does take a little bit of time. That's okay, it can do that. But let's just talk about what this is doing. And Chris already showed you how to do this in an integrated way. But essentially, I've got my k-means model that has 2 up to n clusters. And I'm going to fit that model with my training data. Okay, so here's my X-train data, and I'm going to fit that model. And what I'm going to do is keep the inertia that I already talked about. And it's also good. So that's the average intra distance. And then I'm also going to take a look at the interdistance between them, because really the goal here is to minimize the intra-cluster. That means I want everything to sit together tightly and maximize the intercluster. All right. And so when you plot those two things together, you can see in a good way that the intercluster is getting smaller and smaller. That means it's fitting it very, very well. And then the there's intracluster. The intercluster is getting larger, and that's of course asymptotic. So we would expect that at some point we're not getting more bang for the buck. We're kind of, doing an okay job, but it's not perfect. And so that's what we have to then choose. And perhaps that number is anywhere here from about 5 to 8. Nothing's really changing. So that's kind of that elbow or knee spot that we're talking about. So that's just another extension or another way to look at this issue of how do you choose the right size. So we'll keep that number in mind. One of the questions that Tori, is everyone good so far? Okay.
Yes.
One of the questions that Tori asked about was, well, can I use the information about like the distribution of values in order to make a decision? And in fact, there's a model that you can use that as part of k-means. There's these sort of models that leverage that, but you can fundamentally use that distribution as your driving factor. So k-means does not, in its default form, does not take into account the distribution of data. It is strictly a geometric approach. So that means it is calculating distances and just simply measuring the distances between things. However, we can look at the distribution of values, kind of like what Chris did at the end with his one plot. And we can use that to kind of make a decision. So I can use this notion of distributions and say, if I have some data, I'm going to assume that my underlying data sets are Gaussians that have been mixed together. And this is quite common to do. We know that the more samples we get, the more we start to look like normal distributed data from our sampling point of view. So if I can make assumptions about those distributions, then I can use that and I can say the optimal place to split, in this case, this 1D thing, the optimal place to split this is where there's a trough between these two. Or maybe there's 3 or 4 or 5, but there's a trough here. And so if I fit some Gaussians here, that will actually tell me exactly where to cut. Because remember, whenever you're making decisions about overlapping things, think of statistical testing. The optimal choice for making that decision is where these two things cross. If you go too far one way, you've got type 1 error. If you go too far the other way, you've got type 2 error. And so here we've got a distribution. You've got this density plot that perhaps, as at least it's drawn, shows two different Gaussians. It's blending those together. And we want to use that in the same way. Now, just like the last one, it requires guessing the number of Gaussians to use, or the number of clusters to use. And we'll talk a little bit at that. So this is a very robust method. This method is actually much more robust at dealing with outliers, because essentially you can normalize those outliers by assuming your distributions are correct where no one sample is correct. And the other one, you keep those outliers in place. You say, well, even though it's way out there in left field, I'm going to keep it in. But here, we don't have to worry about that because the distribution basically normalize all of those out. So you don't have to worry about outliers that are in fact true outliers. So while it is a robust method, we still have to know the number of clusters ahead of time. And so again, we're going to do that same process. We're going to choose a range. In this case, I'm going to go from 2 to 9. And essentially what that will do is it's going to use that range and loop over that and run Gaussian mixture models that you can see here. So again, we just say, I would like a Gaussian mixture model. It's no different than saying I would like a k-nearest or k-means model. Either way, we can use that. And then we're going to fit that model. And in this case, where before I was measuring the intra versus the intercluster, now I'm measuring something that's related to the distributions. That is, how tight are my distributions? How representative does the data and the distributions line up? And that's called the AIC. This is a Japanese scientist from like 50 years ago who figured this out. So this is the Akai information criteria. So I'm just going to hit play on that. That's going to take a minute. That's why I did that. So essentially, if you think about it, the goals are not that different. In the one case, we're trying to imagine the k-means problem as a probability problem where we want to maximize the distance between these and minimize the distance within these. It's the same sort of a thing. It's done differently. One's geometrically, one's done from a distribution point of view, but they're really trying to achieve the same goal. So I'm currently, I don't know if you guys can see it on your own screens, but at the bottom, it's executing. This one is gonna go pretty fast. It's actually a pretty efficient algorithm. The next one is not so much, but we'll take a look at this and see what we learn. Anyone have questions here? It's just a good time to stop because it's still running the model. All right, not hearing any, I will just let this finish and I'll circle back around to it. So Gaussian mixture models, very common. The actual framework under which this, great, we'll get to that in a minute. The actual framework under which Gaussian mixture models works Gaussian mixture models is the framework. One way to implement that is the expectation maximization model, where you go back and forth between making an assumption about your models, like I'm going to guess that these are my two models, and one is centered at 5 and has a standard deviation of 3, and the other is centered at 10 and has a standard deviation of 5. And you first guess, and then you look and see how well it fits the data. Then you adjust your data to fit your model, and you go back and forth, throwing out outliers and making adjustments along the way. I think we're almost done with this. Maybe I didn't have to go to 10. That's just going to take a while. This also may not be the most efficient way to do it. This is just so that you guys can see the process of looping over the range to calculate this AIC criteria. And what you're going to find is this criteria is going to peak out where there's an optimal balance. And so it kind of converges into this peak. However, notice that I had brought up convergence before. And here it says initialization 1 did not converge, try different parameters. That is because this, like k-means, does not guarantee convergence. That means you could build as many models as you want, but there's not a unique minimized or maximized solution for it to converge on. And so you either need a set of criteria that says, I'm willing to give up early, which is essentially what this did. This went for a while and then it said, forget it, I'm wasting my time here, I'm going to stop. Or you can add some sort of other ways to try and control for that. So convergence can be managed by damping criteria, which you can't do in this particular model, but you can do it generally in optimization. So mine just got done. I don't know if anyone else has got done already or is working. Let's take a look. So what we're looking at is how well does this number, how well do we hit this peak? And this peak is somewhere in this sort of 5 to 8 range for a Gaussian mixture model. I would probably choose this sort of at this elbow spot or knee spot, as they sometimes call it, to say that this is my optimal number of clusters. Now, one thing I mentioned is I didn't show anything so far about what those clusters actually look like. And that's because looking at clusters when you have, 128 subjects across 12,000 variables is a very difficult thing to look at. But one method that you get where you get visualization built right in is what's called hierarchical clustering. And so that's the last step that I'm going to go into. Before I do, are there any questions on either the k-means some more or on Gaussian mixture models? Okay, not hearing any, I'm going to sort of go into this last one, which is called hierarchical clustering. So I call this a strategy requiring less information, often returning less information. So people really like hierarchical clustering. It's like a first thing out of the gate for a lot of people, and it becomes obvious why. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get to a hard and fast answer. It just gives you a lot more to noodle on. So hierarchical clustering removes the need to estimate estimate the specific number of clusters a priori. Instead, the algorithm attempts to look at all of the data, consider essentially, quote, all of the possible cluster outcomes. And this, as you can imagine, is computationally intensive. So if I ask you to go to a parking lot and I ask you to cluster all the different vehicles in that parking lot, all right, you go from car to car and say, is car A different than car B, different than car C, different than car D? Okay, now is car B different than car C, different car E, different car F? Okay, what about F? And so on and so on and so forth. And essentially in doing that, what you do is you sort of guarantee that the most similar things are brought together first. All right, it's actually also it's worth noting this is a deterministic strategy versus the other one, which have a random component having to do with how they're sampled. This is absolutely deterministic because you're comparing these things, although there's a probabilistic version of it, which I won't go into. So this is very computationally intensive, but it avoids the needs to make assumptions about the data. You're really looking at all the data and essentially doing an all-to-all comparison and sort of building it from the ground up. So first you go through and you say, okay, everyone's their own cluster. So every car in the parking lot is its own cluster. Then it says, okay, for all the clusters that exist, which is everyone, compare them to all the other clusters and merge the things that are closest together. Once I merge, then do it again. Take all the clusters that have been merged and you merge them again. And we do this so on and so forth until everything's been merged. So then essentially what we have is a tree. We're at the very top, and we'll see this in a minute. At the very top of the tree is one cluster that has everything. The very bottom of the tree is every single sample is its own cluster. And then you look at that. So to get into that, I do have some slides here. We already talked about this, but there are different methods for computing distance. All of these things, including this one, requires a notion of how do you compute the distance. We talked about Euclidean, which is from point A to point B. We talked about Manhattan. There's another one, which is the Canberra distance, which is like a weighted city block distance. So that imagines if you have to go uphill and downhill along this, so you can weight it that way, or if there's costs to going one way or another. There's another really interesting one, which we won't go into, which is called the Gowers distance. These distances right here all assume continuous variables, or at least ordinal integer variables, something you can measure a distance kind of geometrically, whereas a Gower distance can have discrete values as well. Neither here nor there. The other thing is how we define a cluster. So we already talked about this one as well, where the common one, as in k-means, is the centroid. But another way to calculate the distance between a cluster is the distance between the two closest points, or the distance between the two farthest points, or the all-to-all distance between all the points. All right, so there's different ways to measure the distance between these clusters. And this is important because remember, we're merging clusters as it goes up the tree. So I probably should have had everyone run it first, because this one is slow. It'll take about 2.5 to 3 minutes to run. But what we'll do is everyone hit play first. Oh, you can't hit play yet, even though everyone just did. In my case, I chose we have to talk about the link method. That is, what is the link between the clusters? Is it the center to center, shortest, longest, longest? Or there's the distance method. What we need to know that, again, the distance that we're going to use to calculate between these things. And then together we can then calculate these trees. So actually it was the last one that went really slow. This one went really fast. I'm just going to pause here and say that you have to set this value between 0, 1, and 2. And all that does is select, is it single? Are we taking a look at a single point between them? Is it complete? Is it the distance between the furthest points? Is it average? Is it all to all? And I left out centroid. And then the distance method can be Euclidean, city block, or the weighted city block. City block is the same as the Manhattan distance. And so I happen to choose single and Euclidean. So single means give me the closest point and calculate the Euclidean distance. And what we see is actually a really terrible plot. What this shows, so here are across the x-axis are all of our different distances. Or I'm sorry, all of our different samples, 128 people. And those people then, again, they're all have basically a very similar distance between them. And so they merge way, way up here. And then from there, then we start to see patterns emerging. I'm going to suggest, because it is far more interesting, that we use something like, let's go 2 and 1. So the link is 1, that is complete. That is the furthest point between them. And the weighted city block. And I'm just going to run that one real quick. And hopefully that's going to give us something more interesting. So check this out. Now we're starting to see some more interesting patterns here among the data. There's something similar about all of these in terms of how they are distributed, in terms of how close or close or far they are from their additional the additional subjects. And then we see these other clusters as well. So this is what's called a dendrogram. You can see that there. I did not mean to click into edit that. Let's get out of that. There, okay. So it's basically the method that I just described of building up each of these things. So the x-axis are all of our samples, the 128 people. The y-axis are the merging of clusters into parent clusters. And the distance is the distance at which these things were merged. So this is very visually compelling. I think it's neat. I haven't really talked anything about the coloring. The coloring actually has to do with some property that we know about the data that I'm not going to go into. So in comparison to the last one, where that preconceived notion of what the data means, which is this one label, let's let that finish, that kind of scatters it all over the place. Whereas here, when I link them up this way, I see a lot more sort of consistency in our data in terms of how it looks. So this is, I think this is interesting, but at the end of the day, if I ask someone to interpret this for me and tell me the right number of clusters to choose when I'm analyzing my data, or the most important clusters, and maybe that it might be a cluster that's all of this, but it might be all of these down here. If I asked anyone, even a knowledgeable person, how to interpret this, they're going to have a hard time, because there is no inherent decision that is being made by the algorithm. The algorithm is presenting you kind of with the all-to-all comparison, and it's on you to then contextualize this completely. And so that's why I say it requires less information, namely I don't have to specify the number of clusters, but also returns sort of less information, because I have no more definitive answer, not that's definitive, but even more confident answer about what is the right number of clusters to be looking at when I'm trying to interpret the data after it's been clustered. Okay, so I know I kind of whipped through that one. I wanted to do it with enough time for questions. Does anyone have questions?
David,
So when
this
looking-
Ron. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Ron.
David, this is Ron Jensen. Is there an element of that falls into statistics? You know, for instance, if you run let's go back to the k-means, for instance. If you ran a model and then you said, okay, so now I'm only going to consider the data that's within, 3 sigma of that or 6 sigma of that or whatever, and assume the rest of the data is falling out because of some unknown situation. Do you ever get into that sort of thing in this world?
You do, and in fact, there's 2 ways to do it. There is the built into the model, so there are advanced models for k-means and all these that try and bring that context into it, like constraining outliers and all that stuff. There's another model of doing this post hoc. So you look at your clusters and you say, okay, after the fact, this doesn't make a lot of sense. Why is this one different? Or why are these outliers really outliers? And you can actually interpret those separately. There is a problem here. And I'm not going to have a lot of time to go into it, but the short of it is, in both of these cases, you used outliers as an example. There's other kind of constraints you can put on, not just outliers, but things that are missing data can lead to sort of invalid clusters. One of the issues, if you look at this sort of post hoc, that is, you take this data and you say, oh, you know what, in hindsight, that outlier, I don't really like that. I'm going to get rid of that. Or you say, oh, there's some missing data. That's okay. I'm just going to put in some value willy-nilly. What ends up happening is you end up biasing your model without really thinking about it. And in fact, so I just taught my lecture on what's called rigor and reproducibility in NIH research. And there's this problem that we have, that we look for bad data and find reasons to exclude it, but we never look to see if the good data is in fact really good data. And that you, for example, might have repeatedly entered the same value into your spreadsheet of information. You might have repeated your subjects multiple times. You kept clicking 6s instead of a 6 or a 7 because of where it is on a keypad. So yes, all these methods are out there in terms of, let's say, curating your data. But the most important thing, the caveat I have to put on that, is that when you're doing that, whether it be curating your data before your model or post hoc curating your data, make sure you're conscientious of the potential bias you bring to the data because of that. It basically forces the data into some preconceived notion of what you're expecting. And that should at least be acknowledged, if not considered dangerous in some situations.
Thank you.
Yep. Other questions or comments? Okay, well, so that's the extent of what I had put together. And Of course, we saw what Chris was able to put together, and these are all out there for everyone to look at and play with, including the references. So I'm really excited about this being our fourth one and moving into kind of a different domain in the case of being unsupervised now and just thinking about data differently. There's a lot of work that we could continue to go into here. One of the things that we could talk about is in this space is some of these advanced models that try and bring in context or bring in statistical models and something that's generally geometric. We could do an entire lecture on things like calculating distance and the different ways to calculate distance. One of the things that particularly you see in clustering, kind of by definition or by necessity, clustering is used in high dimensional data. High dimensional data meaning we collect a lot of variables. And in fact, there's this issue of the curse of dimensionality, which I don't recall if we've discussed before, but as we add more variables, we add more variable spaces. As we add more variable spaces, there's actually more space that has to be explored, if you will, by your optimizer. And that curse of dimensionality can be quite concerning. And there are some techniques which kind of fall into the unsupervised classification domain, depending on how you interpret it, which is transformation-based modeling of your data. And this is where PCA and ICA come in. And so that's just another whole space for us to look at that we could spend some time on. And that I think I've done enough talking. Chris, back to you.
Thanks, David. I don't know if anyone has any feedback on what they'd like to see at future workshops. Any of the topics we've covered that would particularly interest someone else to see coming up. If you don't have any suggestions right now, if you want to send us via email suggestions, that'd be great, because we were hoping to provide stuff that people are interested in seeing. And while we can always pick a topic, it's much more interesting to provide information when it's something specific or maybe applying to a real world topic someone's interested in.
So Chris, let me give you due to my involvement in IEEE in various roles and so forth, one of the things that I'm really interested in is trying to figure out, which members are going to continue to be members and which ones are going to drop, which ones can we retain and so forth. And is there some relationship to data, such as, like the number of meetings that they attend, or the distance from where the meetings are held, or the subjects of the meetings and that sort of stuff. If there was some way that we in IEEE could begin to figure out what that is, maybe we would modify our way of offering program and where we offer them and that sort of thing. So that's one of the things that's always hanging around in the back of my mind. How can I take the data of who dropped in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years and try and figure out is there a relationship? Is there a model that begins to predict that?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting idea.
So Ron, I think this is a great idea. And in fact, what I would like to suggest is that we turn this specifically into one of these workshops. We'll do this analysis together. In order to do that, in order to be able to make this a guided kind of exercise, what we do need to do is get a hold of the data that you have right now, what you think is data. And we'll be able to take that, and then we'll be able to work through loading it, curating it, applying models. Maybe some people will apply a clustering model. Other people could apply a supervised regression style model, that sort of thing. So maybe you would be willing to provide us with any data that you have. That could be on spreadsheets or other things. Just provide us whatever that kind of data you can get, and we'll sort of formulate a strategy around that. And then we can have it as maybe one of our next sessions. Yeah.
I'll see if I can do that. If I can pull together a set of data that would make some sense. So yeah.
Okay.
There's a suggestion in the chat box.
Okay, and that is? How do I get there? I don't know how to find that. I had it up when Brian was doing it. How do I get to that?
Maybe a session on intro to RL.
So reinforcement learning, presumably. Certainly we could, I think that's a good idea. Let me think about where to fit that in. We might want to have a session or two before we get to it, but definitely I think our reinforcement learning is another great topic. So let's make note of that. Awesome. Okay, so that was a great suggestion. Was there more in the chat?
That's all for now.
Okay. Good.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for attending. I know Dave has been recording this and we'll be posting it to our YouTube channel. So if you want to catch up with it there. I don't know if you have any other closing thoughts, Dave, you want to add before?
No, I appreciate all your effort, both that you put into it. I think it's a good. I enjoy these every time and enjoy the progression of you know, and how it's kind of building on each other, or even how it's kind of branching out a little bit too. I look forward to future sessions as well. So yes, we will. This will get posted up on our YouTube channel in the next day or so. Then we'll look to maybe schedule another one in the fall, as we have kind of been running these twice a year now. So thanks again for joining, even Chris. And if anyone has any input in any regard, whether it was the content tonight or future suggestions, feel free to send me an email. My email address is dpaulsen, PAULSEN @IEEE.org. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, Chris.
you.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, everyone.
Night.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.